Debt, the Case of SADC. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the International Development Law Unit in the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria and the co-hosts of this event, our publishers, the Pretoria University Law Press, Afrodad, and Afronomics Law. This book has been a 2-year project supported by the generosity of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And I want to take this opportunity to thank ASISA for their support. It's a book based on a very competitive process that began with a call for papers and that led to a very tough selection of some papers, which were then presented at 4 workshops in 2020, and we'll put the links to those workshops in the chat box. At each of those workshops, the presenters had the privilege of having some international experts as commentators to give advice on the book, and I want to take this opportunity to thank them for doing that. Then out of that, 15 papers were selected that went through a peer review process. And I want to thank the anonymous peer reviewers as well. And I'm hoping some of them are quietly listening to this workshop for their work on doing that. And as I said, we ended up with 15 chapters written by 18 authors. And I'm proud to say that 2 of the authors are graduates of the LLM in Trade and Investment Law in Africa program that we sponsor. 2 are graduates of our doctoral program, and 1 is a current doctoral student in the program. The book also, thanks to ASISA, will be translated into French and Portuguese and will be available open source online within the next few weeks. So the book is freely available to everyone throughout the SADC region. Our goal in doing this project, I should say, was to not only inform people, but to stimulate discussion and debate and research on this important topic of sovereign debt management in the SADC region. And to the best of our knowledge, this is the first book that's ever been done on sovereign debt in the SADC region. And so we hope that it will have this impact and will lead to much more work being done on this region. I should say, as I was thinking about this launch today, it struck me that if we were starting this project now, unfortunately, the title of the book would have to change. It would become COVID-19, Ukraine and Sovereign Debt, the Case of SADC, because the situation has become much more challenging since we wrote the book as a result of the war in Ukraine. Many more African countries, including in the region, are suffering debt challenges at the moment, and many more are likely to do so in the coming year. But so I think this is it's an opportune time to have a discussion about this and to start it and to hopefully stimulate more discussion and interest in the topic. But to begin the proceedings today, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dean Elsabe Skuman, the Dean of the Law Faculty at the University of Pretoria, to say some opening remarks and also to thank her for her support for all the work that we do, including for this project. So Dean Skuman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bradlow. And thank you for the invitation. It's always good to be part of your unit's presentations and work, as well as the broader Center for Human Rights. As you know, the center is such a flagship center of the university, and IDLU is a big part of that. So it is always an honor and a privilege for me to be part of these proceedings. So let me also welcome everybody who has joined us. I see people are still joining, and people are joining us from all over the African continent, all over the world. So a warm word of welcome to you from wherever you may be joining us today. Yes, 2 years ago, we often talk about this now, that a little over 2 years ago, we would not even be Zooming like this. And despite all the negative effects that COVID has had, it has given us this. It has given us these virtual platforms. And for us, the challenge will now, of course, be how to maintain all of this and also do some in-person presentations and conferences again. But just to say that not all about COVID was that bad. However, when we think about COVID, it presented the perfect storm, because all the existing inequalities, poverty, lack of access to education, scarcity of food, unemployment, all of this combined with a devastating pandemic and a disease that we knew nothing about. And so it really forced us to take stock and rethink and to see what the future will hold, and also to plan for the future in a very different way. We now know that we may also have other events, not necessarily a pandemic, but there will definitely be environmental events. And so we now have to prepare for these events. And previously, we knew that they might happen, but I think COVID really drove that reality home to all of us. Initially, we all saw and listened to ministers of health on TV, and COVID seemed like a health issue or a medical issue or a science issue. But gradually we realized that it was also very much a social sciences issue, and that all disciplines will have to play a crucial role through the course of this pandemic and also post-pandemic. So the world that COVID stepped into also framed the response to this pandemic, and it put in stark relief the reality of almost not a single discipline being left untouched. So we were actually ripped from our comfort zones. I don't think there's anyone, any researcher, any author that does not now embark on research or writing a book without thinking of COVID. You know, what is the effect of COVID? How should I treat this in my research or in the book that I am writing? And so we've come out of our comfort zones, and it's also a good thing, because this is now resulting in multi and transdisciplinary research. And that is really the only way that we are going to be able to find solutions. The good thing about COVID, and I find that quite ironic, is that even though we were locked down at home, most of us, we were actually forced to climb out of our silos and engage with other people and other disciplines across a very wide spectrum. So I find it quite ironic, but I think that's also one of the good things that happened during COVID. And this is also what we see in this book. When you look at the scope of the book, it is very, very impressive, to say the least. And I can just imagine how hard all of you must have worked, researched, and how difficult it must also have been for you to make a contribution to this book with so many uncertainties still out there. But I've started reading the book. I can't claim to have read the entire book. I've dipped into some chapters. And what I find very, very informative about this book is the scope and how it has been done. So it takes stock of the history of sovereign debt. And for someone like me, who does not have a solid background in this, that is fascinating and very interesting to look at what worked, what did not work, the lessons that can now be taken from that. And even though it is aimed only or limited to the Southern Africa development community, I think the content of this book will have relevance far wider than just SADC. It will also be relevant for the rest of the African continent and also globally. Of course, it addresses the unique context of SADC and the way forward. And that is also something that I find very inspiring, is that we are now in a position to look back and also to look forward. And for me, it is very important to see and to hear the young voices in this book, because we know that if there is one thing that the African continent has that others don't, it is youth. Youth is really a very strategic advantage for us. And so it is really heartening to see that, Professor Bradlow, you've also included a number of very young scholars. I was really happy to see that. And that is what we should be doing. I have a lot of faith and confidence in our youth. They are linked up, and they are out there, and they are confident. And it's really good to see those voices in this book as well. So I would really like to congratulate all the contributors, the editors, and also Pulp for this stellar publication. As Professor Bradlow said, it is new. There is no such book at the moment. This is the first one. And so this is the beginning of a newly informed dialogue, a conversation across boundaries and across continents. And one might even say that the pandemic has given us a new voice. So congratulations to everybody who made this possible, who participated, who worked long hours and relentlessly to get to a point where this book was published. It's also quite an achievement to have a book on COVID published at this stage already, because we know we've only had 2 years. It might have felt very long, those 2 years, but it's not a long period of time in which to bring together all these authors and also to be able to finalize a book. So congratulations to everybody who participated in this fantastic project. And I wish you all well. And of course, this will not be the last word on this topic. So please carry on and make your voices heard. We would like to have African solutions to African problems. And I hope that this launch this afternoon will also be very informative. I'm so pleased to see that so many people has joined us, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you very much, Professor Bradlow.
Thanks very much, Dean Schoeman, for those words. And the goal today is to have as lively a discussion as possible. And we also have a group of young people, young scholars and young commentators to lead this discussion. To kick us off, to give everyone a sense of the program, I'm going to invite my co-editor of the book, Dr. Magali Masamba, to give us a short overview of the whole project and the whole book, and then to invite 3 of the authors, Louis Kuhn from the University of Johannesburg, Farai Mutandoro from the African Center for Environmental Law, and Professor Dunya Zongwe from the School of Law at Alliance University in India, to introduce their chapters to the book. And then we have 2 commentators to talk about the book generally. Firstly, Jason Braganza, who's the executive director of Afrodad, and then Aurelia Akini, who's a doctoral student at the Schulich School of Law at the University of Dalhousie in Canada, to give some general comments. And then we've allowed lots of time for general discussion. So we are hoping everyone will participate as widely, as actively as possible in this discussion. Please feel free at any time to put questions in the chat box or comments in the chat box. And we'll use those to keep the discussion going. So with that, let me hand over to Magali to speak for about 10 minutes, and I'll be quite strict on time just to keep us moving along. But Magali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Danny, for giving me 10 minutes to summarize quite a long book. Of course, I won't do justice in 10 minutes to describe the fantastic contributions by both the international and African scholars that contributed to this project and the rich research that brought this book together. I can see a couple of the contributors online: Martin Kessler, Mary-Louise Aaron, Barry Herman, Rosalien Jackson, and others. So it'll be great to hear from them during the Q&A session as well. I'll look at three main points in my 10 minutes. Firstly, I'll look at why is the subject of sovereign debt topical, and why are we talking about Africa, why are we talking about SADC. I'll briefly describe the direction that the contributors took in the book, and we'll conclude with a few thoughts that Danny and I came up with after looking at all the contributions from the author. So as a starting point, really, this project explores the challenges of debt management and restructuring in the SADC region. And it really came about at an opportune time. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a call for papers. And as the first chapter in the book indicates, which was co-authored by Danny and I, the pandemic really had a major social, economic, financial, fiscal implication globally. And for African countries, we've really seen a weakening of already vulnerable welfare systems. And the pandemic has also had an adverse effect on interregional trade, international trade, investment flows, and even access to financing. But when it comes to debt, the real question has been, what is the impact on the ability of African countries to service the debt in the next few years? And of course, as we've mentioned today, especially in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, this question is even more pertinent. Now, African countries, especially sub-Saharan African countries, have had a very long and complex history when it comes to unsustainable debt. And of course, we've had past initiatives such as the highly indebted poor country program, the HIPC, and the multilateral debt relief initiative, which really aimed at putting African countries, or at least giving African countries, a clean slate. And of course, these programs had indeed reduced the debt burdens of African countries, despite of also facing quite a number of criticisms. However, you will find that after these programs, African countries again began to reaccumulate debt and did so at such high volumes that there were fears that African countries would revert back to their pre-HIPC levels. And this was even before the pandemic. So for instance, between 2011 and 2019, sub-Saharan African countries more than doubled their debt levels, from approximately 259 billion, according to the World Bank, to about 535 billion. So already before the pandemic, there were concerns. So in 2013, for example, the World Bank noted that 8 African countries were already at high risk of debt distress. In 2014, for example, the managing director of the IMF also raised concerns not only about mounting debt levels, but also the proliferation of Eurobonds. In 2016, UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, also raised concerns, and also international scholars were talking about Africa's debt levels, some of whom I can see are joining the session today. But coming back to the current context, in November 2020, Zambia, a SADC country, was the first country during the pandemic to default on its debt when it failed to make a $42.5 million payment on a Eurobond. And other African countries also showed signs of difficulty when it comes to debt repayment. And the global response was mainly 2 programs, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, as well as the Common Framework, both of which really fall short of a comprehensive approach to debt restructuring. And now when it comes to the pandemic itself, the book is quite clear on the fact that the impact on debt servicing has not been uniform across the SADC region. So you'll find that certain countries or some countries entered the pandemic in a better economic shape than others. And at present, you, for instance, have Mozambique and Zimbabwe, which are luckily 2 of the case studies today, which are already in debt distress. We have Malawi, Zambia, and Comoros, which are examples of SADC countries that are at high risk of distress. So despite the fact that different countries are facing different challenges when it comes to debt servicing, one point does seem clear, and that is there is the need for a resolution, or at least a comprehensive approach or resolution when it comes to Africa's over-indebtedness, but there's also a need for individual countries to prioritize governance responses. So when it comes to the second point, what direction did the authors or the contributors of the book take? The authors addressed the contemporary issues of sovereign debt management, debt resolution, and the broader debt governance in the SADC region. And they also they not only looked at the challenges, but they provided policy recommendations. And you'll find that the book took a multidisciplinary approach. But we can pull out a couple of themes or a few themes from the different chapters. So a few of those that really stand out is that the authors looked at the challenges of transparency and corruption. They looked at the challenge of determining debt sustainability. They looked at how fiscal responsibility provisions can be used to ensure sustainable debt accumulation and management. They also looked at the power imbalances of the debtor-creditor relationship and how these impacts the kinds of debt agreements that we enter into. And also they looked at the available debt restructuring options and the extent to which they deal with the deeper structural issues, for instance, human rights. So this is generally the approach that the authors took. Some conducted case studies, but generally you can pull out some interesting themes from each of the chapters. I'm not sure if I have a minute or two left, but I will conclude, Danny. So when it comes to the conclusions that Danny and I made when looking at what is the future of debt management and restructuring based on the contributions by the different authors, we pulled up 5 broad themes, and perhaps after speaking, I'll share an op-ed that was published in The Conversation today that also provides a summary of some of these key findings from the book. So just to summarize them, we see that there is indeed a need for enhanced debt transparency. And of course, this need for transparency really relates to the need to adopt comprehensive data disclosure requirements, but also the fact that state borrowing procedures really need to be transparent as well as participatory. A second interesting point that we concluded after reading all the chapters by the contributors is, of course, that really good governance needs to be at the core of debt management. Thirdly is the issue of legal predictability that really requires strengthening contractual provisions in debt contracts, especially when it comes to how do we draft our contracts with respect to risk allocation. Fourthly, the complex question of comparability of treatment between creditors is a really important feature when it comes to restructuring. And this is not only about giving creditors the same deal, but really brings up some of the complex legal questions, like how do we bring all creditors or different forms of creditors to the negotiating table? And finally, the overall conclusion, in my view, and of course, Dan, you can correct me or add on to it, is really the need for a comprehensive approach when it comes to debt. And of course, when we talk about a comprehensive approach, we're talking about an approach that takes into account some of these broader concerns like human rights, climate change, and development. And that broad approach relates to, for instance, restructuring and debt management and so forth. So Danny, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but just as a brief summary, that's what I've got so far, and I'd be happy to share more thoughts during the Q&A session. And it would be great to hear from the authors as well, some of whom are in attendance. Thank you.
Thanks, Magali. You were absolutely spot on, exactly 10 minutes. So thank you, that was perfect. Let me hand over to the first case study, which is Louis Kuhn, who wrote on Mozambique and the debt situation in Mozambique. So Louis, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Prof. And I'll try to keep time as well as Magali did. But thank you, everybody, for giving me an opportunity to just speak about my chapter. And as Magali also mentioned, when we wrote the book, so much has gone on to change. I mean, the war in Ukraine, what we are seeing now is that there's an increased move within Western countries to actually have to raise interest rates. And there was an interesting debate around Mozambique as to whether the persistent low rate environment actually contributed to these instances as companies are chasing yield because of a lack of actually being able to obtain higher yields within their own countries, and then to seek higher yields in countries like Mozambique. And of course, the governance issues again that Magali highlighted. So what I looked at in my chapter is the history of the various debts, the Imatum debt and the MAM debt and the Pro Indicus debt, and how that came about. So I considered the indictments in the US, and really the chapter effectively operated on the presumption that the allegations were true. So the chapter is not about going into the whole debate of whether the allegations are true or not. So for purposes of the chapter, it was assumed that they are true, who pled guilty. And of course, Credit Suisse itself, who has now entered into a guilty plea and is paying a fine and forgiving some of the debt. But really, that doesn't finally resolve the issue, because only a small portion of that debt that is actually being forgiven. Mozambique's legal battles with most of the banks continues. Its legal case against VTB continues. Its cases against Credit Suisse continues. And now, of course, there's also the delays involved with the arbitration proceedings, and certain matters cannot be heard until the arbitration proceedings in Switzerland are resolved. But in the chapter, what I also do is I distinguish between the different types or the different debt that Mozambique had, and look at the debts that were restructured and the debts that were not restructured. Because as a matter of Mozambican law, it's quite simple to say that these debts are invalid, and the Constitutional Council of Mozambique, of course, confirmed that. And they also confirmed that the resolution that was passed by Parliament subsequently, invalid debt with validity, is also invalid. And I think it is important that there is clarity on the fact that if creditors engage in corruption, that they effectively risk losing out on the debt completely. Of course, these debts ultimately they are governed by English law, and then in the chapter I look at the transfer of the debt or the settlement of the debt, and that restructuring then being innovation, meaning that the fact that the initial debt was affected by invalidity doesn't mean that the restructured debt is also invalid. And there's a need to really work on that. And I think that is where, as Magali said, we also have to think about the content of debt contracts, because what we're seeing with Southern African countries, I mean, it's quite common for the dispute resolution to be externalized. Rarely does our debt problems get resolved, for example, in New York or in London, with the growing issue of claims for sovereign debt in investment arbitration. And I don't go into a lot of detail on that in the book chapter, but it is something we consider, and the lack of clarity really on what the approach is in terms of international investment law if we're talking about debt and corruption. I mean, we've had certainly the earliest cases saying that corruption is against transnational policy, and that first of all the tribunal could decline jurisdiction, or it could decline to enforce the debt. But then there comes all kinds of debates when it comes to the evidential burden. So for example, I look at Metal Tech, which says that it's sufficient to establish effectively a presumption of illicit activities. And that's quite important in the context of debt, because often you cannot directly prove the corruption. I mean, some of the cases that we're seeing is where government officials are being hired as consultants, or close family members of them are being hired as consultants. And to prove that that is corruption is quite difficult. And then we have cases in investment law, such as Lau Holdings versus Laos, where they said that the burden of proof is effectively not quite beyond a reasonable doubt, but something close to that. And that becomes very difficult in the context of debt. So it's not yet clear what the approach is before international tribunals for determining
Louis,
corruption, and of course in the agreements to all corrupt those, so an agreement procured through bribery.
Louis, you keep breaking up. It might help if you turn your camera off, I think.
Can you hear me now, Prof?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, thank you. So what I was saying is that the approach when it comes to how corruption must be addressed in relation to the substantive validity is maybe not as clear as we would ideally have liked for it to be. And of course, there have been improvements in this, but what would be interesting is if we could see a move towards making some of our more soft law instruments into hard law, beyond just having to have this uncertainty. But I hope that everybody who's read the book enjoys the chapter. I'm just about out of time. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Louis. I think the Mozambican case shows two things. One is the importance of governance. And even if you have good laws, it's abiding by the laws is important. And the other thing it shows in debt, which is often underplayed, is that it takes two to tango. There's always a debtor and a creditor, and if there's something that goes wrong, often both sides have blame to share, or share in the blame for that. And that's certainly the case in the Mozambican debt. Next, we have Farai Mutandoro, who's going to talk about resource-backed loans, particularly in the Zimbabwean case. So Farai, over to you. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, and greetings, colleagues, wherever you are. My name is Farai Mutandoro, and I'm with Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. I coordinate their think tank arm called the African Institute for Environmental Law. So we did this paper with Josephine Chiname, Tuzot Liwayo, and Anna Sophie. And the paper looks at COVID-19 in terms of disruption and how it interplays with resource-backed loans as a financing modality to development. And I think it is very important for us to have this discussion now, as you're saying, Prof, that there are many disruptions ahead. Ukraine is just one avenue. And I think when we did the paper, one thing which we missed out, and which I'll speak to, is the COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy, in terms of China pumping in a lot of resources, giving doses and vaccines to African countries. Then the key question is, for what in return? So allow me to take you through the chapter that we did. And I think at the time when we did the study, I think COVID-19 was the greatest shock to the global economy. And I think the background to that has been that I think for years, IMF was expecting growth, but due to COVID-19, we saw economies crashing. So, but prior to that, nation states had for years explored different modalities of financing development. And but literature was so silent on resource-backed loans as a financing modality in which countries access finance in exchange for or collateralized collateralizing mineral resources or streams of income from their natural resource wealth. But I think it is important to note that I think resource-backed loans were not a new thing, because if you go back to the 2009 or the mid 19th century, you would see Peru's guano-backed borrowing. So it was not a new thing per se. But around 2019, NRGI, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, I think they brought our attention to the resource-backed loans in Africa, sharing that in between 2004 up to 2018, there were around 52 resource-backed loans in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. More importantly, they show that about 53% of these loans to African countries came from Chinese state-owned policy banks like your China Development Africa, your Export-Import Bank of China. But I think there's nothing wrong with resource-backed loans. It's about financing development. The key question, and I think this is what we make very clear in the study, that they need to be very transparent, because the implications are far-reaching. And we profile the Zimbabwean case study as an example. So with ZIM, you would note that mining is at the center for economic recovery. At the time I'm speaking, I think we structured a mining economy roadmap where we anticipate to unlock $12 billion from mining by 2023. Zimbabwe is endowed with vast mineral resources. You'd know for a fact that I think palladium, which is part of the platinum group of metals, is doing quite well in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Zimbabwe is also endowed with huge reserves. I think is the sixth holder of the largest lithium ores in the whole world. So mining then is at the center of our economic recovery and prospects for growth. But I think as a result of strained relations between Zimbabwe and the West, we could not access financing through the traditional lenders like your Paris Club, your World Bank, IMF. But starting in 2000, as a result of that strained relations, we saw government of Zimbabwe looking east and trying to access financing from China. So since 2004, I think government of Zimbabwe started to get capital or finance from China. But the worrying thing then for the chapter is that there was no transparency in around some of these resource-backed loans, irrespective of the very fact that if you look at the Constitution of Zimbabwe, there are many provisions which says that engaging in such borrowing needs approval of Parliament, needs high level of public transparency and accountability. But all these deals were done opaquely. More importantly, I think we note that Parliament was not even consulted, and the challenge with our Parliament, even if they were consulted, it's one-sided, so it's more of rubber stamping process, of which now we need civil society to be involved. But that aside, I think the other interesting angle is what these loans were used for: more consumptive, building a defense college, which alone, I think, is not an investment. You cannot unlock financial value out of a defense college. Not to say security is not important. Security is important, but I think we have other priorities, like a crumbling public health system in Zimbabwe. So those are the worrying angles of resource-backed loans, especially in ZIM. But again, I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict shows another worrying angle of resource-backed loans, in as far as if you project growth, that by selling oil, for instance, or selling your gold, and global commodity prices fluctuates, they depreciate, then I think there are hard-hitting impacts on the economy. We saw Chad when they securitized their resources and they could not perform. Nigeria as well, Angola. I think we've seen that. So that's the danger of over-reliance on mineral resources. So I want to conclude on the aspect of COVID-19 diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy. I think again, there's no transparency. I think in January, the president was telling us that China donated 10 million worth of vaccines to Zim, and we're seeing that trend all over Africa. Then the key question then, could this be linked to resource mortgaging? Because there's no transparency and accountability around some of these bilateral agreements between our governments. And I think it's not worrying per se, but I think it's a call to action for civil society and scholars that when China does business, because they do not have civil society in China, often at times there's no consultation and civil society is not part of the bargaining process. So we need to build capacity of our parliamentarians and policymakers to reflect through the terms and conditions of some of these resource-backed loans. I think one case is that of Huawei, where government of Zimbabwe through the mobile telecommunication companies got a loan, and one of the conditions was that the 5G infrastructure rolling out would be given to Huawei, and Huawei was not going to be taxed for the next coming 4 or 5 years. So that sort of tax exemption, again, I think Jason will speak more to domestic resource mobilization through taxation. You can then not do this if this is not transparent. I want to conclude on that note, since the conservation, Prof, and take questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Farai. Perfect timing. And it's a good place to end on taxation, because the next speaker, Dunya Zongwe, is going to speak about fiscal policy in Namibia in particular. So Dunya, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bradlow. May I please, is it possible to share the screen? It's going to be just a brief PowerPoint for people to follow my explanations.
Yes, it should be.
Okay, no problem. So I will then share my screen. Please let me know when you can see it.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Just a second, please.
Still not.
Okay. I think that my screen is a little bit frozen, so I will start waiting for it to show. Just let me know at least if you can hear me properly. So
no problem hearing you. So talk away.
Yes,
there you go.
Yes, and I will actually stop my video just to make sure that I protect my bandwidth. Yes, I can start here by saying that in 2020, the headline of the main daily in Namibia was saying that government in a deeper debt ditch. So that was a number of months after the COVID-19 had arrived in Namibia, and it referred to the fact that Namibia was finding itself in a very difficult situation from a financial budget point of view. Then, okay, so just a moment. I think I really have a problem here with my presentation, but anyway, so the argument that I'll be advancing is that in order for developing countries, and Namibia in particular, to address the what I call the liquidity and the strategy dilemma, it will have to enable the central bank, the Bank of Namibia, to act as a fiscal council. So the reason why I'm saying this is because one of the things that I have observed looking at Namibia in particular is that the COVID-19 pandemic and the future pandemics will confront, and as confronted, developing countries with a dilemma between addressing short-term liquidity emergencies and then long-term development strategies. So in order to address this dilemma, my argument is to say that the Namibian government has to structure the central bank as a fiscal council. So this argument has two components. The first one is to say that if you look already at the Bank of Namibia Act, which was passed in 2020, it is already structuring the central bank as a fiscal council. And then alternatively, I mean, in the alternative, and that's the second component, in the alternative of people saying that, well, but if we look at that same Bank of Namibia Act, we do not really have the impression, or we are not convinced that the central bank has actually taken on such a role, then the alternative argument would be to say that, well, but given the Bank of Namibia Act and the SADC central bank model law, the only conclusion that we can draw is that the central bank would be the best suited to fulfill this role. So to make this argument, I will be, my presentation will be, okay. My presentation will mount a fiscal council framework in order to help Namibia and developing countries to strike that delicate balance between short-term liquidity and long-term strategy. So to my short presentation, we'll have three parts. In the first part, I'll just look quickly at the framework, the fiscal responsibility framework that I'm advocating. Then I'll look at the proposal, which is the main thesis. We can call that thesis the fiscal central bank. And I will end with some discussions about the objections and some of the concerns that could be expressed with relation to the proposal or the thesis that I'm advocating. So like Professor Bradlow and Dr. Masamba have already said, there are very few people who have already actually looked at this question of COVID-19 and debt in the context of Southern Africa. The same could be said also when it comes to budget system laws. Very few have actually looked at that. My presentation addressed this gap. The unfolding COVID-19 crisis has created a manifold pandemonium that affected the economy, the healthcare system, and state finances. I'm concentrating on the finances because most governments had to borrow. Both South Africa and Namibia had to borrow, but the problem is that these kind of disasters like COVID-19 pandemic tend to push up the public debt to unsustainable levels. So it's all about sustainability. And the question is, well, how do we ensure that the debt remains sustainable, given that Namibia has neither a fiscal responsibility law nor an explicit fiscal responsibility framework? And this is especially important given the statistics regarding Namibia. Mwinga, who is a finance expert in Namibia, has said that Namibia has been sleepwalking its way into troublesome debt to GDP domestic product ratios. The debt to GDP ratios has jumped. It has jumped from 7% at independence to 45% in 2019, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And the cost of servicing has actually jumped from 1 cent in a dollar to actually close to 10% or 10 cents in a dollar. So, and in last year, Namibia received a loan from the IMF that is worth about 4.5 billion rand. And in the next 3 years, Namibia is expected to have a debt burden that would balloon to 158 billion. So since 2016, before COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to note that the Namibian economy entered recession, and that because of COVID-19 pandemic, the economy contracted by more than 6.6%. So the question is Namibia's debt even sustainable? Because we are talking about sustainability. On the one hand, the Namibia's debt to GDP ratio is still better than what you'll find in most African countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the average is 48.2%, and then 56% in SADC, and even Namibia is even doing better than the average in SACU. Okay, just a moment. So on the other hand, however, Namibia has no way to ensure that its finances doesn't get worse, and that's exactly what I was saying. There's a lack of a fiscal responsibility framework. So if you look at the existing framework, you have the Constitution, State Finance Act, the Bank of Namibia Act, and the Appropriation Acts, which are budgets. The one that comes closest to a fiscal responsibility framework is the Bank of Namibia Act. So what would a fiscal responsibility framework contain? There's a number of things. I cannot discuss it because of in detail because of a lack of time, but if you have any questions about this, we can talk about this in the Q&A session, but it will have to deal with transparency, deficit ceiling, expenditure ceilings, escape clauses, debt sustainability, of course, because we are all discussing about sustainability, and the question of sanctions should the government not meet certain targets. In 2022, Namibia was in a deeper debt ditch. In 2020, Namibia was in a deeper debt ditch. And in 2020, this year, it is swimming in debt. That is what the main newspaper is saying. So you can see, you already have a sense that the situation is getting worse. So hence the necessity of a fiscal responsibility framework, and my argument, the necessity of a fiscal central bank. So the Bank of Namibia Act, when I mean fiscal central bank, what do I mean? If you look at the Bank of Namibia Act, it recast the role of the central bank in at least in 5 roles. Number 1, in a developmental role. Number 2, in a fiscal role. Number 3, in a lending role. Number 4, in a foreign debt management role. And number 5, in a debt manager role. It is important to note that the Bank of Namibia Act is an enactment of the SADC Central Bank Model Law, which was passed in 2019. 3 countries in SADC have already enacted it in national law, and that includes Namibia, Angola, and Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's also important to note in Section 73 of the Namibia Act that the Bank of Namibia has a developmental role. This is especially important in light of concerns about neoliberalism in this SADC Central Bank Model Law. I don't know how much time I have. I want to make sure that I don't exceed my time, but please let me know if there's 5 or 4 minutes left, or even 3 minutes left. I want to concentrate. Sorry?
2 minutes to go.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll go quickly. So I wanted to concentrate on the foreign borrowing role, because the new act requires the government to consider the Bank of Namibia, to approach the Bank of Namibia first before they can borrow. And the Bank of Namibia now has to consider such borrowing and look at it to find out whether it is financially or economically appropriate. And then the Bank of Namibia must report to the Finance Ministry and make recommendations to the Minister on measures that are necessary. So given the current situations, the deteriorations of finances, and to even underline the necessity of a central bank, is after being in a deeper debt ditch and after swimming in debt, we should make sure that the next headline next year will not say government drowning in debt. So I made the propositions that the solution is to institutionally, apart from the fiscal responsibility framework, institutionally, the Namibian government has to restructure or rethink the Bank of Namibia as a fiscal council. But the concern is that at the same time, the idea of a fiscal responsibility, of a fiscal central bank, is concerns about neoliberal economics, because fiscal responsibility law is a outgrowth of neoliberal economics, and the SADC Central Bank Model Law itself is a neoliberal instrument. So my argument is actually not for Namibia to embrace neoliberalism, and I make in my chapter recommendations on how it can avoid that. One of the things that I can say is that if you look at the Bank of Namibia Act, you will see that it imposes democratic control, in the sense that the governor of the central bank has a duty to report annually to Parliament. And that is one of the ways in which the general public and civil society can also make sure that in the way it operates, it does not embrace blindly neoliberal economics. So one of the concerns also with my idea is that, well, it is a bit naive, because central banks are supposed to be independent, and in making the central bank a fiscal council, you are basically going to politicize the central bank. My argument is to say that, well, it's not naive to believe that a country like Namibia, that has a reputation for the rule of law, one of the best countries in terms of observing the rule of law, will comply with the law and make sure that it does not compromise its independence. And in Section 5 of the Central Bank of the Bank of Namibia Act, it is even a criminal offense to interfere with such independence. To understand also the concerns that people may have, they say that why the central bank? There are other institutions that could have done that, the Auditor General, the courts, or Parliament itself. But my argument is that the central bank has 2 advantages. The first one is that its independence is legally protected in a country that has a sterling reputation for adherence to the rule of law. And then secondly, and I'll end here, it has great expertise and more resources when it comes to the macroeconomy, system-wide risk, and debt sustainability. Having said that, I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I did not exceed my time too much.
Thank you, Dunya. That was great. I mean, we've had 3 very interesting case studies, 3 countries in the region that are facing debt challenges. One that also raises an issue of governance issues as well. One that talks about resource-backed loans and the questions of security and how debt relates to environmental and social issues as well. And then one that raises the complicated questions of the relationship between the central bank, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and raise a lot of complicated issues around that. We have 2 commentators to talk on that. You asked to go first. So Jason, if you're okay with that, I'm going to invite Aurelia to speak first, and then Jason will come on afterwards with 10 minutes each, and then we'll open for discussion. So Aurelia, over to you. You need to go off mute.
Okay, sorry about that. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much to Bradley.
Sorry, you really maybe switch your video off because your sound is bad. So maybe let's see if that's better.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you very much to Professor inviting me to fantastic event and congratulations.
Sorry, Aurelia, we can't really hear you.
Okay.
Can you come closer? Have you got some sort of a speaker that you can speak closer to?
Okay. Is it any better now?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, as I was saying, that I'm very grateful to both you and Dr. for inviting me to the event, and congratulations to all of you. And just like given.
Sorry, I hate to do this. You keep fading out. What I suggest is let's go to Jason, and then if you can see if you've got, maybe if you put on some headphones with the speaker, it might be better. But we can't really hear you, and we don't want to lose what you're saying. So if we go to Jason, and then we'll come back to you, and that gives you a few minutes to see if you can sort out the problem.
All right.
So Jason, thanks for being flexible. Over to you.
No worries, Danny, and thank you very much to you and Magali for inviting me to speak during this soft launch of this very, very important book. I must say, when I first heard the news of its launch, I was very excited and very happy to have managed to get not only a soft copy but a hard copy of the book for all of those who are in attendance. It's compelling reading for those who are interested in what's happening. So on sovereign debt issues. So I do encourage as many of us on this call to share it widely and engage with it. It's really an important read. I want to just start also by congratulating Danny, you and Magali for one very important political part of this book in terms of the authors of the different chapters. I think it is a critically important feat to have gotten so many African authors together to put this book together and to put this publication together. And I just want to congratulate both of you for this, because many of these discussions tend from a global North perspective, and to have such a rich collection of global South and specifically African academics contributing to this book is something very phenomenal. So congratulations to you both, and to the authors who gave their various contributions to this very amazing book. I think contextually also, I agree with the sentiments that were made by the Dean and as well as Magali and Danny on the context has changed so dramatically, just from COVID-19 to Ukraine, Russia, and what it means for monetary fiscal policy, but also how public debt is governed. And in the 3 chapters that we have, had the pleasure of listening to, there's so many important things that come out. And I'll try and go chapter by chapter because that's sort of how I approached it in preparing my remarks. And first of all, the Mozambique debt case made, for me, at least 4 very important points come out of this chapter. The first one around how the calculations or recalculations were being made, when the risks of default were getting very close, and how that affected the ability for Mozambique to restructure its debt with regard to some of the sovereign Eurobonds in particular. I think this is an important cautionary note for those who are in central banks, those who are in treasury, who make these types of decisions to float bonds in capital markets, to take a cautionary approach in understanding the terms and conditions, should they be a situation where a government cannot afford to pay and enters into a period or into a process of default. And I think for me that point really stood out quite immensely, given the way the value of the bond, then the value of the new bonds then increased quite substantially. I think in one of the cases that Lewis talks about, the value of the bonds goes from 726 million to 900 million in terms of its value, just because of it having to be restructured. So I think that's a very important point there in terms of how governments negotiate when they're going to capital markets. The second point that stood out for me, and this is something that many civil society organizations are now beginning to pursue very actively and robustly, is this idea about where debt is governed. Where is the starting point and where is the end point? And the point Louis made around the invalidity of guarantees as per Mozambican law vis-a-vis English law, I think was a point that stood out for me because of the inability then for domestic legislation to protect the government, and in this case protect the borrower in the instances where there is a difficulty to pay or to honor the debt. Now, this is by no means an attempt to try and absolve borrowers, right, from their irresponsible borrowing or from their corrupt ways of achieving or of accessing debt. But really what we're saying is that there needs to be an attempt to protect citizens who bear the brunt of such situations in a domestic legal framework. And this is especially important in this chapter on Mozambique, because the type of debt we're referring to that's being discussed here was commercial and private debt, which where with current practice, the starting and end point is international law, which makes it very problematic for African governments specifically, but developing country governments more generally to negotiate and to get access to legal advice to renegotiate and deal with international arbitration. So I thought that was a very important point that came out there, and it is something as a recommendation I felt also throughout the entire book, where this really seems to resonate with the work I do at Aphrodite, and I know many others who are on this call and other civil society organizations that are trying to think through this idea of having domestic legislation play a much bigger role in protecting government and citizens from the challenges of restructuring, reprofiling, and default. The third point, and I think this is also linked briefly to the chapter that Farai and both Dunia have presented here, is the dichotomy that's being presented between the Ministry of Finance and the central banks. And in the Mozambican case here, there's a bit of a gray area in terms of who had the power to do what. And I think this is interesting because in many countries across the continent, ministries of finance do have quite substantive powers to take on financing on behalf of government and for government operations. But as COVID-19 has shown, and this is the point I think Dunia was making, the central banks are actually playing a very important role when we look at some of the relief measures, especially things like special drawing rights. These resources are going straight into central banks first before being on lent to national treasuries and ministries of finance. So I think, again, the book and this chapter and the one on Namibia present a very interesting dynamic in terms of how we need to appreciate these different roles, and whether really in theory there seems to be an appetite for an independent central bank, but in reality, in times of crisis, there does seem to be push and pull levers that treasuries have on central banks. We've seen this, very blatantly in the global north with central banks lowering interest rates to very significantly low rates to allow fiscal policy to then prevail and create fiscal buffers for economies, for businesses, for people. So I think that's a very interesting dichotomy that came out in the 3 chapters, but also across the book. And I think, as African activists, academics, practitioners, this relationship is something worth exploring in the context of macroeconomic stability and dealing with monetary and fiscal policy space during times of crisis. And of course, the fourth point, that came out in this in the Mozambican chapter, and again sort of links to the point, the chapter that Farai was involved in on resource-backed loans, was the issue of the integration of international norms with domestic legislature. And I think this was the point here about how debt can be defined, whether it is through corruption, whether it is odious. I think there being some sort of standard around what is considered to be a dangerous or unsustainable debt instrument or debt contraction in the international setting is very important, that then finds its way down into domestic legislation, again, as a way of providing some sort of safeguard to borrowing countries, but also acts as a check on lenders, because then they need to re-galvanize and rethink about how they interact with developing countries, particularly in Africa. And I felt this was an important point because of the way the landscape has changed, right? As Magali was presenting, the interesting thing, of course, is the creditor landscape in Africa has changed quite dramatically. Not only are we seeing a declining role of what we would consider our traditional Paris Club lenders, but also the form of the bilateral lenders are changing, and the way they do business is extremely different. And then, of course, there's the emergence of the appetite for commercial and private lending. And I think that architecture needs to be checked with regards to domestic legislation. And the reason I say this is because in the chapter on the resource-backed loans, we do see very clear evidence, actually, that not only are some countries going to non-traditional bilateral lenders, they're also going to commercial and equity lenders to look for that money or that financing in order to exploit the natural resources or to finance their development agenda. So I thought that was something that came out really interestingly for me across the 3 chapters in the book. I think finally, as I read through the book and the 3 chapters, 2 final messages that really are glaringly obvious in terms of recommendations is that the global architecture really needs a kick up the backside to accommodate an African economy and an African continent that is increasingly playing a vital role in commerce, trade.
Jason, are you still there? I think we've lost Jason. Jason? Well, if Jason comes back, there you are. Are you
Sorry,
back?
I think this is the Tanzanians telling me to stop. So I'll just stop there. But the last point was just the architecture just needs to reform to accommodate a growing Africa, basically. Thanks, and congratulations once again.
Thanks, Jason. Lots to discuss there. I can see you've come back on a new connection. So hopefully this time it works smoothly. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And once again, just want to say congratulations to you and Magali and to all the authors for this wonderful and very insightful book. I very much enjoyed reading it, and it has really informed some of the discussions and ideas that I now have. And for that, really congratulations to all of you. So just like Magali had said before when she was introducing the book, it addresses some themes, and just to mention a few, some themes like challenges of transparency and corruption in debt accumulation, the challenges of relating to debt sustainability, power imbalance in debtor-creditor relationships, and also the availability of debt restructuring options, and the extent to which these options actually deal with the deeper structural issues affecting the society, such as sustainable development, human rights, and environment. And the book, and given that Jason has actually tried to address some of the issues or comment on some of the chapters, I will try to address the book beyond some of the issues that go beyond the book itself. So just to kick us off, the book initiates an interesting debate on whether human rights is actually a sovereign debt issue. And it acknowledges that the laws on human rights and sovereign debt have historically been treated as two distinct fields. And despite the over-indebtedness in developing countries in way back in over 5 decades back that link sovereign debt and human rights, we see this even in the way the IMF and the World Bank responded to the debt sustainability concerns by introducing the structural adjustment programs, that is the SAPs, which have been criticized for times without number for not sufficiently considering human rights. And the book also makes reference to Banteka's and Lumina's book on sovereign debt and human rights, which also has really insightful comments there on the relationship between the two. And it identifies some of the gaps that arise between the gaps that exist between sovereign debt and human rights. And the book actually exposes that the gap between sovereign debt and human rights exists because of the difficulty in a multidisciplinary approach to the two fields that have distinctly or traditionally been distinct, and also the challenge of tracing the use of borrowed funds and determining and quantifying human rights obligations of states, which is a point that I really I found quite illuminating, because it is indeed true. While it is indeed true that human rights approach to international finance of sovereign debt has been unpopular with the financial sector, given the challenges of implementing human rights policies by financial institutions. Currently, there are noticeable exceptions, given that some developments have occurred in the space, particularly because some of these international financial institutions and even the domestic ones have human rights policies. So this shows that there's clearly a direct link between sovereign debt and human rights. But translating this into the practical world has actually been a problem, because there still are hostilities, even in the contemporary world, there still are hostilities between the two opposing camps, that is the human rights perspective and the commercial law perspective. And this is mainly due to over-specialization, maybe, and it just doesn't stop there in scholarship. It also is also evident in the manner in global politics, where there's noticeable difference in opinions between the global north and the global south on whether human rights is actually on whether sovereign debt is actually a human rights issue. And this is evident or apparent in the voting patterns of United members, the United Nations members. And for example, one notable example is during the 16th session of the UN Human Rights Council, when during the UN resolution of the mandate of the UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, the United States is actually on record saying that one, human right sovereign debt is not a human rights problem, and that the focus of United Nations is misplaced because there are other institutions that are more suited to address this based on their technical expertise. And these other forums that the United Nations, that the United States is actually referring to is the IMF, the World Bank. And that particular stance is also echoed by the EU during the UN resolution of the UN draft principles on sovereign debt restructuring process. And they say the same thing, but the question that we need to address at this point is IMF really the most suited forum to address the human rights implications of sovereign debt? Is fairness really the attribute of the IMF? Does the institutional framework of IMF and even the other multilateral banks, multilateral development banks, is fairness their attribute really based on the institutional framework? And the answer to this actually depends on which side of the divide you are. For those who are pro-status quo, they will say that yes, the institutional frameworks of these institutions are actually more suitable to address the human rights concerns that arise from sovereign debt processes. But then, to those who are anti-status quo, who believe in fairness, think and actually are of the view that the IMF is not, because based and some of the examples that have been raised in these debates, one of them is that the IMF and its quota system which determines, among other things, the voting power of a member state. It is not fair, because the IMF officials themselves have in the past admitted that the quota formulas do not always accurately reflect the economic size of some of the member states, and this mostly the frontier markets. So it is therefore impossible for the IMF quota system to capture the actual position of emerging markets and developing and the other developing countries and the least developed. So clearly, and even this is also seen even in the composition of the IMF executive board. And it is also clear that the IMF in itself is a political institution, and that is also clear in one of the chapters, and that must have been Harry, who also suggests or gives more insights on how political the IMF is. And it is clear that therefore that even the political imbalance that is also exacerbated by the economic policy conditions of the IMF undermine the country ownerships of development policies, and this also further marginalizes the developing countries and the least developed ones. So and finally also on the fairness of the IMF and the other institutions, we see that there's actually a challenge in the convergence of roles between the IMF and the WTO when it comes to balance of payment surveillance of developing countries. How possible is it for developing countries that are suffering, that are experiencing sovereign debt crisis and balance of payments challenges, how possible is it for them to invoke the GATT provisions on balance of on quantitative restrictions? How possible is it? And that also, which brings us to question the legacy of the India quantitative restriction case of the WTO. It offers some of the most insightful decisions that we need to critique as members or as scholars who believe in an anti-status quo. So beyond this book, some of the areas that really we need to address in sovereign debt issues, that I'm also glad that this book initiated the discussion. We need to address the social implications of, for example, the social implications of public-private partnership. How do, for example, contingent liabilities arising from PPPs, how do they impact on sovereign debt? Because we see right now, for example, the situation in Kenya where with these projects, with this the Standard Gauge Railway project, we see the expressway project that builds a very beautiful road infrastructure. But then what are the social implications of that? Are we only looking at the financial aspect of this project? What are the implications that this particular project have on, for example, environment, on diversion of resources, of public resources? Are we paying all? Are we using all the services or all the revenues that we have accumulated as a country to service debt, to service the debt? And also another area that we also need to look at is how do we mainstream also gender provisions on sovereign debt agreements, because there's a need to also address the gender implications of sovereign debt. We also need to also address
sorry, you really, one more minute.
Thank you.
If you can wrap up.
Thank you very much. And just like Prof you said before, that in the present case, there is need to also address the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war and its implications on balance of payment. So in summation, what we need to address is, and that's what we need to understand, is history matters. History matters in sovereign. We need to understand the status of the pre-debt status of a particular country, the present status, and even the post-debt status of a particular country, in order to understand how really that particular debt impacts on that country. And in order to do that, we need to present an alternative normative edifice for international sovereign debt agreements. And once again, thank you very much, Professor Bradlow and Magali, for inviting me to this function, and congratulations to all of you and to all the authors. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aurelia, and thank you for focusing so much on the human rights issue. I wanted to point out that the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights has just issued a report looking at the debt crisis in Lebanon and accusing the central bank there of not living up to its human rights obligations. So for people who are interested in this topic, I think that's an important document to look at. I also want to open up now for discussion and to encourage people to submit questions and comments in the chat box. But before doing that, I just want to welcome the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe, who very discreetly came to join us, and to thank him very much for joining us, because I know he's just come from a graduation ceremony. And Professor Kupe, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to give you an opportunity if you would like to say a few words while you're still with us. And once again, thanks very much for joining us. Professor Kupe, if you're there. Maybe if there are people with questions, comments. Professor Coupe, I can see you there now.
Now being added as a panelist, I think enables me to speak.
So welcome.
Yeah, but somehow I can't launch my video. I don't know why. So you okay? There you are. Yeah. So no, I've been listening for a while now. But actually, when Jason was speaking, and then when he also said the Tanzanians cut him off, and then the next speaker after that. So really, I don't want to waste people's time because I wasn't there at the beginning. But I think this is really fascinating stuff. Having grown up as a young man who thought he was a Marxist-Leninist, some of the institutions we mentioned were prime evil to us. The IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, but particularly in the 1980s with the structural adjustment programs. And we all know that what happened in that kind of space, which in a sense, suggested loss of sovereignty over economic decisions. But of course, one cannot ignore that the African countries themselves had not taken policy decisions in their best interests, which would protect their own sort of sovereignty. But I haven't, I've been doing the wrong kind of job for too many years now to try and pontificate as if I'm an analyst like you guys. So I'm just here to be, if you like, to be educated. But I think these are very important debate at this juncture in the life of the continent. And also the question for me always is, how do we actually take ownership of the challenges we have without ignoring externalities and the intersection between externalities and internal decision making? And how do we, in taking ownership of the challenges, turn them into opportunities and create a sustainable Africa and make a contribution to the world? So for me, I'm coming at this topic from that angle, if you like. So, and thanks very much for allowing a bureaucrat to say his bit.
Thanks very much, Professor Coupe. And I think you've given a good challenge, because I agree. I mean, the world situation is terrible. The structure of the global economy is completely against us. But we still have to work out how we can function within that very difficult environment and take advantage and make sure that Africa continues to grow and that create opportunities for its people despite that. And I think that's a challenge for all of us, which I encourage people to comment on and join in. We have one question at the moment, if I can pull it up, from Marian Buenaventura Goldman from Oxfam, who says, has a long question thanking everyone and then saying, each of the presentations have spoken to a call for greater transparency, civil society engagement with government. Does civil society have the space for direct engagement with the ministries of finance and central banks in the three countries talked about, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Namibia, to discuss the role of the IFIs, and in particular the IMF, or for example, the IMF, about resource-backed loans, etc.? Is there only engagement with Parliament that is possible, or is there a way in which to influence and holds government accountable for the way that they engage with the international organizations and the way they deal with debt? That's a tough question, which in the interest of transparency, we should say that we've been talking to Marian about for a while now. But I think it's a good challenge, and I'd invite any of the speakers who would like to respond to that to just indicate or just jump in. Anyone want to start off?
Well, I can say something if unless my colleagues would like to come first.
No, Junior, start off and then we'll go to whoever wants to join in afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Bradlow. I think it's a central question. I remember that when I was presenting my research in November, was it November? Yes, in 2020, one of the concerns, for example, that Professor Gatti raised about the fiscal responsibility framework was this whole neoliberalism behind it and so forth. One of the things to make sure that the system that I'm advocating does not become a tool for markets rather than for the people, was to highlight the fact that in the Constitution, there was a principle of a government policy that encourages people to engage with the government, and that could be used for them to participate in the budget and the fiscal responsibility framework. So that was the first thing. The second one was that although, as I said, the SADC central bank model law is largely a neoliberal instrument, there is a portion, there is a provision in that model that Namibia reproduced in its Bank of Namibia Act, which is a provision that allows the Bank of, no, that not allows, it actually obliges the central bank governor to report on his activities to Parliament. So that allows democratic control over what the central bank is doing, and that is good because even Keynesians, scholars were pushing for more democratic control over the budgeting process. Now, with the question that we've been asked, in the particular case of Namibia, as far as I can tell, the civil society is quite vibrant, but where I haven't, and I'm sure many of those who observe, events in Namibia will also tell you, what I've observed is that when it comes to the budget process, civil society is not very much engaged. The members of parliament make comments on the parliament. They criticize the budget when it is tabled in parliament and the budget policy. But civil society, I haven't seen any vibrant, let's say, engagement from there, although the country, as you know, was, the free press, there's free press, actually, freedom of the press. Namibia was #1 in Africa last year. This is second after Seychelles. So it's not because the government prevents them from talking. What I suspect is that when it comes to debt sustainability, budgeting, and central banking, it is deliberately very technical. It is presented in such a way that an ordinary person will not necessarily understand what it means when the governor increases interest rates, when the governor say, be careful, the debt may not be sustainable. So I think there is what a French sociologist, Boudreau, said that it's like a black box. They make sure that they present information in a way that will alienate the average citizen. And that may be the reason why, if you look at least in the case of Namibia, although it's a vibrant society, on the specific in the specific area of budgeting, debt sustainability, and central banking, participation is not really possible when it's so technical, and it's deliberately made so technical. That's my take. Sorry.
Thanks, Dunya. Anyone else want to add to that? I see a sign saying that there are 2 hands raised, but I can't see who's raised hands. So if people want to just jump in. If you're not part of the panel, I think it's hard to be invited in unless we can do that. Is there a way to invite? I see James Gatti, Professor James Gatti is here. If he can be let in to speak.
Danny, I can also just quickly briefly say, unfortunately, I can't turn on my video. It seems to be been disabled now. But in terms of the Mozambique crisis, civil society did actually play a very big role in both exposing the situation, but also placing pressure, both on government. I mean, we saw some actual attempts initially by Parliament to recognize these debts. So there, civil society definitely did play an important role. And I can only hope that going forward, the civil society organizations in Mozambique would continue to play such an important role in relation to debt. And I think that the Mozambique crisis, I mean, because it's so big, the sheer amount that we're talking about, it might have gathered more attention, but it's certainly not the only instance where there's corruption involved with debt. So I think civil society in general could actually learn a thing or two from civil society in Mozambique on how they actually approach it. And they definitely did play an important role, and hopefully will continue to do so going forward.
Great, thanks. I see James Chidakwa, who had a question in the chat box, is now able to speak. So James, let's go James Chidakwa and then James Gati immediately after that, and then we'll come back to the panel for some responses.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go for it.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing this very interesting and important conversation. Because this conversation is coming at a time when just today, when Parliament and both I'm a member of Parliament in Zimbabwe, when Parliament and there was a debate on the report from the Public Accounts Committee that was highlighting some looting from that was done on the man of the COVID-19 funds. So that alone, after having this hearing this conversation, it leaves us as Africa to say, where are we even going when our leaders can go to the extent of looting that money and the other monies, they come as a debt, and we did not see the impact that it has made in the citizens' lives. So the biggest question is, what are we doing as Africa? What are we doing as Africa to find a lasting solution to the debt issue? And another question that also arises is, what needs to be strengthened? Because even if we our governments acquire debt, there's also misuse of misappropriation of that money, and so what needs to be strengthened? That would be my business question. What can we strengthen? What needs to be strengthened? What is it the laws? Because the previous presenter was giving us the instruments that they have in their country to protect the citizens. So the laws are there, the policies are there. Should they be strengthened? Is it the institutions that needs to be strengthened, or is it the security sector or Parliament, or is it the executive? Because I see challenge, and what has happened in Zimbabwe is also happened in so many African countries where the money that has come as a debt to cover COVID-19 pandemic was looted. So in my view, Africa needs to initiate steps for the United Nations to adopt a unified policy or unified law or instruments on debt issues, in order to place this matter squarely on the agenda of the world institutions. That is the mandate of borrowing money to Africa, and as I always said, our efforts are very broad, because I always see society speaking about these debt issues, conscientizing citizens on debt issues. They have tried, they've done their best, they've shown their courage, but I'm saying this must be merged with a determined action. We must take action as Africans. We must take action now before it's too late. If we don't do that, Africa is losing. The agenda that we have is the agenda 2063. It will be very, very impossible to achieve it when we have such kind of leadership, and when we're heading towards this direction. This is my contribution. I want to thank you so much.
Thanks, James. James Gati.
Thanks, Danny. And I just wanted to add my congratulations to the team, especially to you, Danny, and to Magali for an outstanding collection. I can't emphasize enough why we should have African voices participate in these debates. I'm delighted to see especially Dr. Masamba and so many young women as well. We, the men, have dominated these debates, even in the African context when we've been marginalized. So I'm delighted so many women from Africa are seizing the reins and reminding us about our gender blindness and other kinds of blindness. I also want to applaud you for making this book freely available, because that's really important. There's tons of stuff written about Africa, but people in Africa can't access it because it's behind a paywall. So that can't be, I can't emphasize enough why that's so important. The other point I wanted to raise is I also wanted to thank OSISA. OSISA has really been key to bringing us academics and the people in the civil society groups like Jason, and to thank Jason in particular because he's been, as the executive director of AfroDad, he's been extremely generous with his time, with his counsel, with his willingness to engage with those of us in the ivory tower. So I can't emphasize enough how important this project is for those reasons, among others. I also wanted to just signal two points. I don't know if they are, I mean, I guess they are comments. One is there's so many new intersections that this book explores. I liked very much Akinyi's point about the often forgotten intersection of the IMF's role with the WTO in terms of balance of payments, some forgotten provisions in the old GATT, and there's some really significant case law in the WTO relating to those balance of payment cases, especially from India. And this is in terms of pushing the boundaries about the knowledge in this area. And hopefully Akinyi and others who are doing their doctoral work are going to be pursuing those types of themes. And finally, I like, there are many things to say, but I'll just mention one. I like the emphasis on looking into the loan contracts, something I know that Jason is also very passionate about. And I like very much the chapter that's focused on resource-backed contracts, but also not to forget some of the multinational corporations that are now offloading their ownership of mining operations in Africa and passing on as loans to African governments those investments. You know, Trafigura in Zimbabwe, Glencore in Zambia. Those are really important examples of another back door to sovereign indebtedness on the continent. The Western media is celebrating some of these as, you know, they're saving jobs. But I think that it's more complicated than just saving jobs. Certainly the miners would have lost their jobs, but it means that in these very complex transactions, some of which, of course, some African elites are getting off very handsomely because they would get paid. That's really key, the intersection between let's call it state capture by African elites and multinational corporations, or these transnational corporate elites. I think we should name those. And finally, also, I guess another point that Akinyi mentioned, and the IMF has recently released a paper on this, these collateralized transactions in the context of secured borrowing. So I think the last thing I'll say is that we at Afronomics Law are going to be have put together a sovereign debt academy, and those are some of the things that we're going to be focusing on. And we thank Danny and Magali for setting the stage for the very exciting work that lies ahead. So thank you again, and congratulations to the team.
Thank you, James. And thank you also for the work that you're doing through the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, and to encourage people, if they haven't joined that, they should start participating in that, because it's a good forum for continuing this discussion. We've got 10 minutes left. What I suggest we do is we go around, give each speaker 1 minute to make a final statement, and then I want to invite my colleague Lloyd Kuvea, the Assistant Director of the Center for Human Rights, to make some closing remarks. So please, everyone, if you make very quick closing statements, I think we can still stay within our time. And I think we'll do it in reverse order. So Aurelia, you go first, then Jason, and then we'll come to the speakers. But please be as quick and concise as possible so we stay in time.
Thank you very much once again, Danny, and I hope I'm now clear enough.
More or less.
All right. So, in conclusion, just my final remark. I would just wish that we go against the norm and just fight international financial on sovereign debt, how it advances the imperial tendency and how that actually marginalizes the and development country. And again, also we need to have discussions on how we need to replicate the conditions of the development in this level of country, especially the conditions that result in sovereign debt. So we need to have on the role of civil society organization, on the role of and on the role of civil sector. We need to have and have these mechanisms in place to ensure those are thank you.
Thanks, Aurelia. Jason.
Yes, just very briefly, again, just to echo my sincere thanks for being part of this launch and extend a huge congratulations to you, Danny and Michael, for this book, and to the authors. In terms of closing remarks, I think this book and the chapters within it are really a huge step in decolonizing academic literature on issues of sovereign debt. I think it also gives those who are sort of only focused on economics or macroeconomics, an insight into how the legal framework also works when it comes to issues of fiscal matters and monetary policy. And thirdly, I do think that there is a huge opportunity for us to take advantage of internalizing how Ukraine-Russia is presenting itself away from, sort of your traditional currencies or hard cash currency in terms of sovereign debt, the issue of cryptocurrencies, digital currencies. I think this book also, in one way or another, does offer some initial insights, and certainly there's an opportunity to build on this if we're going to take things forward and reclaim back some of the continent's sovereignty when it comes to monetary and fiscal policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Dunya.
Okay, thank you very much. To conclude, I would say that my contribution to this project was to emphasize on debt sustainability. The question is, should the finance or the fiscal authority be left alone? Should they be left alone? My answer is no. If you look at least in the particular case of Namibia and the trajectory of debt, the answer is no. The central bank should act as a fiscal council because if only because there is a legal framework to support that role, but also because they can, by virtue of their independence, legally protected independence, they can more effectively ensure that sustainability. But on the other hand, and I'll conclude there are several trade-offs. There's a trade-off between short-term liquidity and long-term strategy. There's a trade-off between central bank independence and politicization of the central bank. Politicizing the central bank, that's what I meant, sorry. And there's another trade-off between dealing, and it's just a reformulation of the problem, dealing with the crisis of today and the generations of the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Farai. Farai, I think you're on mute. Well, Louis, let's go to you, and then if Farai comes back, we'll get it. You can make a final statement.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. I think in my closing remarks, I just echo Jason that there really is a need to also reassert African sovereignty in dealing with African sovereign debt. And I think the Mozambique situation shows us again how far-flung these issues are actually being resolved, and not ultimately in terms of Mozambican law. And thank you very much for for allowing me to participate in this book project.
Thank you. Magali.
As my closing statement, I'll mention that perhaps this book raises more questions than answers. And that's because the project was aimed at really stimulating debate. And I guess the final way that we are taking the debate further is that we're going to make the French and Portuguese version of the books available within the next couple of weeks. But really, in a way, this is the beginning of a project and not really the end. And we're almost passing on the baton to organizations like Afrodad, Afronomics Law, other civil society organizations in the chat, academics, members of parliament, to kind of start taking the debate forward. And what debate is that? It's the debate to establish an international framework for debt restructuring, the debate to link sovereign debt to other issues like human rights, climate change and green growth, gender, and all of the different issues that have been brought up. Thank you.
Thanks, Magali. Lloyd, just before I come to you, just to see if Farai is back and able to make a final statement. It looks like not. So it's my pleasure to introduce again Lloyd Kuvea, who's the Assistant Director of the Center for Human Rights. And I want to thank Lloyd because he's stepping in at the last minute in place of the director, Professor Frans Viljoen, who unfortunately is not well. But thanks very much, Lloyd, and welcome. And over to you.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you very much, Danny, for this invitation for me to stand and in place of and to deputize Professor Frans Viljoen, who hasn't been well, but I'm also glad to announce that he's now on the recovery path, and that is really positive news for us. So yeah, to this launch, wow, this is an amazing resource, Danny and Magali. And really, I want to thank you for your contribution to another pulp publication, which I think, as many people have already stated, and as you have stated, will be free and available. It ought to be disseminated broadly across the continent. And it is great, really, that it will be translated into French and Portuguese. I'm not so sure if there's any Spanish-speaking country on the continent, but I think we are quite comfortable with French and Portuguese. At least it covers more broadly, the breadth of African countries. And I think, and I really want to congratulate you because the book, it has achieved its purpose. At least, the lively discussions really go to show that it has stimulated debates on the issue of sovereign debt. And I have no doubt that it will do the same when it is broadly disseminated to the broader public, as well as generally the African community. And let me also add my voice to what people have said about the contribution of African scholars. And this is very important. And I think the Open Society Foundations are also taking a deliberate approach to really finance and support African scholarship on the globe, so that the African issues are really tackled by African scholars and researchers. And this is very important. And so thank you so much for really bringing together such a team, and really want to thank the contributors for coming up with very interesting chapters. I'd like to thank, again, obviously, Afrodad and Jason, thank you so much for all the support that you have given to the publication and discourse on sovereign debt. And of course, OSISA, really they've been great in terms of supporting research, especially within the SADC region. And it's really good that they have not just focused on civil society, but also funded work being done by academic institutions. So we really are grateful for that. In terms of, I will not comment, on the some of the chapters, because I think a lot has been said. I just want to also just thank you for really making the link between sovereign debt restructuring and human rights. For us, I think, as civil society, as academic institutions concerned about the impact on human rights, it's an area that we will be interested in, especially in terms of taking this work forward on aspects of advocacy. You have no idea how this book is going to empower a lot of activists on the continent who did not have the knowledge that is contained in this book when they engage international financial institutions. I know, for instance, that the IMF and World Banks and other international financial institutions, have in the past engaged civil society organizations, and I've been privileged to be part of that process. But many a times you find that the knowledge has been lacking when it comes to that engagement. So really, this book is an excellent and amazing resource for that. It will really empower African scholars and African activists on the continent. I just also want to say that, the aspects that were raised, I think, by James Chidakwa, he must be a member of parliament, I guess, about the issue of regulation. I think that is also critical, given the lack of transparency that you've mentioned here, the issue of lack of transparency. It is absolutely critical for there to be regulation and monitoring. And perhaps one would want to see an increasing role for our parliaments to be empowered in terms of looking at how the governments are entering into some debt that becomes burdensome, not just to the government of the day, tax, and also the failure by the governments to then realize and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. So it seems that I'm 3 minutes above, beyond the 6 p.m. cutoff point. So I'd just like to end here, Danny, and really congratulate you, Danny and Magali, on what I really consider to be an excellent resource. Just one more addition, and to complicate matters for you, because looking at the link between sovereign debt and COVID-19, I'm already thinking about the link between sovereign debt and climate financing. So perhaps that should be your next product, Danny and Magali, and also bring together another team of excellent contributors and scholars on the continent. Thank you so much, and a very good evening, and congratulations on this very, I think, successful launch.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. As you said, we're past the cutoff time, so it just remains for me to thank everyone, to say, as Magali said, that this should be the beginning of a discussion and a beginning of action on these issues, not the end. And so please, I hope everyone will continue staying in touch and working on these issues. As Magali said, there's an article in The Conversation today about this book that I'd encourage you to look at, but certainly for those of you who are academics, I'd also encourage you to write for The Conversation, because it's a good way of getting your ideas out and encouraging discussion around these issues. And they're a great group of people to work with. I also want to thank the various other authors who didn't speak today, but who participated in this event, and thank them for their nice comments in the chat box as well. And that I hope we can continue this discussion in another forum at another time. But thank you everyone for participating, and have a good evening. Thank you.